Hi guys, the night air above the Nile River was still warm long after the sun had disappeared behind the western desert. Far away, somewhere beyond the dark water and the low mud brick walls of sleeping villages, dogs barked softly into the distance. Palm leaves shifted in the slow wind. Small cooking fires faded into red embers beside narrow homes built close together along dusty roads. Most people were already asleep. Fishermen rested on woven mats beside their rolled nets. Farmers slept beneath thin linen sheets while the heavy smell of river mud drifted through open windows. Somewhere in the darkness, a donkey shuffled quietly in its pen. A baby cried for a moment and then settled again into silence. The Nile moved gently through the blackness. Its water carried the smell of wet earth and reeds. It moved slowly under the moonlight, just as it had for thousands of years, feeding the fields, feeding the people, feeding the long ribbon of life that stretched through ancient Egypt. And in that quiet world, where every season depended on the river, food meant survival. Not luxury. Not pleasure. Survival. Long before sunrise, before the cool blue light touched the eastern horizon, the first workers were already awake. Sandals scraped softly against packed dirt floors. Clay jars were lifted carefully in dim rooms lit only by oil lamps. Women ground grain with heavy stone tools while half asleep. Men stretched sore backs after long days in the fields. The sound of grinding grain was one of the oldest sounds in Egypt. Slow. Steady. Almost endless. Inside one small home near the riverbank, a mother leaned over a flat grinding stone while her young daughter carried baskets of barley from a storage jar in the corner. The grain smelled dry and dusty after months inside sealed containers. Tiny particles floated into the lamplight as the kernels were crushed into coarse flour. Outside, the air was cool for a little while longer. Soon the heat would arrive again. It always did. Ancient Egypt survived because people learned how to prepare for that heat, for floods, for drought, for insects, for sickness, and for empty seasons when the fields gave nothing at all. Storing food was not simply a task. It was part of every hour of daily life. Every family thought about food constantly. How much grain remained? How much beer could still be brewed? Whether the onions would survive another month. Whether the fish drying outside would spoil in the heat. Whether rats had entered the storage jars during the night. In the villages beside the Nile, homes were often built from mud brick mixed with straw and river clay. Their walls kept out some of the afternoon heat, though not all of it. Roofs were flat and sometimes used for sleeping during the hottest months when the indoor air became too heavy to bear. Inside these homes, storage space mattered deeply. Large clay jars stood against walls beside woven baskets filled with lentils, garlic, beans, and grain. Linen covers were tied carefully over openings to keep insects away. Some jars were sealed with mud. Others were lifted onto raised platforms to protect food from damp ground and wandering animals. The smell inside these storage rooms was thick and earthy. Dusty grain. Dried herbs. Old straw. Smoke from cooking fires. The faint sour scent of fermenting beer. Egyptian families did not have the luxury of wasting food. Every kernel mattered. Every loaf of bread required labor from many hands. Grain had to be planted, watered, harvested, carried, threshed, cleaned, stored, ground, and baked beneath the burning sun. Even wealthy households understood this rhythm. But for ordinary workers, the balance between enough and not enough could feel frighteningly thin. As dawn slowly approached, faint gray light spread across the eastern sky. Roosters cried from nearby courtyards. The village began to stir. Men walked toward the fields carrying wooden tools across their shoulders. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes while carrying water jars from communal wells. Bakers reopened clay ovens still warm from the previous night. Soon the smell of fresh bread drifted through narrow streets. Bread was the center of Egyptian life. Simple flat loaves. Round loaves. Dense loaves filled with barley or emmer wheat. Some were coarse and rough. Others were softer for wealthier homes. Bread was eaten in the morning, in the fields, during work, during rest, during festivals, and before sleep. To store grain safely was to protect life itself. Far from the villages, larger storage systems stood beside temples, royal estates, and busy cities. These granaries rose above the ground like giant mud brick towers. Workers climbed wooden ladders carrying sacks of grain upon tired shoulders while scribes sat nearby recording every measure with careful hands. The scribes worked quietly in shaded corners whenever possible. They carried pallets with ink and brushes made from reeds. Their fingers were stained dark from long hours of writing. One by one, shipments of grain were counted and recorded. So many sacks from this village. So many baskets from those fields. So much barley delivered after the flood season. Nothing escaped the notice of the scribes. In Egypt, grain was more than food. It was payment. It was wealth. It was power. Workers who built temples and tombs were often paid in grain. Soldiers received grain. Bakers needed grain. Brewers needed grain. Even priests overseeing temple rituals depended upon carefully measured food supplies stored in massive granaries. The system had to work smoothly. If the grain spoiled, people suffered. If the flood waters failed, everyone worried. The Nile flood was both a blessing and a source of constant anxiety. Every year the river rose slowly, spreading dark fertile mud across the fields. Farmers watched the water carefully, reading its height against stone markers. Too little flooding could mean poor harvests. Too much flooding could destroy homes and wash away precious supplies. When the flood waters finally retreated, planting began almost immediately. Oxen pulled wooden plows through wet soil while workers scattered seeds by hand. Birds followed behind them searching for fresh grain. Children shouted and waved sticks to drive the birds away. The work was endless. Day after day beneath the glaring white sun. Feet sinking into wet earth. Sweat soaking linen clothing. Hands rough from labor. And always in the back of every worker's mind remained the same quiet question. Would the harvest be enough? Months later, when the grain finally ripened golden beneath the desert sky, harvest season transformed the countryside into a landscape of movement and dust. Sickles sliced through stalks while laborers bent low for hours beneath brutal heat. Donkeys carried heavy bundles toward threshing floors where animals trampled the grain loose from the husks. Dust rose everywhere. It coated skin and hair. It settled into mouths and eyes. Workers coughed as they lifted basket after basket into the wind for winnowing. The lighter chaff drifted away while the heavier grain fell back down. Then came the storage. Perhaps the most important moment of all. Fresh grain still contained moisture. If stored carelessly, it could rot. Mold could spread quietly through entire supplies. Insects could hatch inside warm containers. Rats could ruin weeks of labor in a single night. So Egyptians became experts at storing food carefully. Granaries were designed to stay dry. Airflow mattered. Workers inspected supplies constantly. Older grain was often used first while newer grain remained sealed for later seasons. In small villages, neighbors sometimes helped one another repair storage rooms before harvest time arrived. Cracks in walls were sealed with fresh mud plaster. Roofs were checked for leaks. Broken jars were replaced when possible. Everyone understood the danger of spoiled food, especially during difficult years. Some evenings, after long harvest days, workers gathered beside the riverbank to rest aching bodies. They sat quietly eating bread, onions, and dried fish while the sky turned orange and deep purple above the palms. The river breeze felt soft against overheated skin. Nearby, boats drifted slowly through fading light carrying grain toward larger cities farther north. Sailors adjusted linen sails while listening to water slap gently against wooden hulls. Trade moved constantly along the Nile. Grain, beer, oil, salted fish, dates, honey, garlic, figs. The river connected everything. And yet ordinary people rarely lived comfortably. Even in years of good harvests, life demanded hard labor from dawn until darkness. Food storage reduced fear, but it never removed it completely. A farmer might stare into his storage jars at night counting silently in his mind. How many weeks remained before next harvest? Would the children stay healthy? Would sickness come during winter? Would insects spoil the grain before spring? These worries settled heavily over Egyptian households like fine desert dust. In wealthier homes, servants managed much of the food preparation and storage. Large kitchens baked dozens of loaves daily. Meat from cattle or birds might be salted, dried, or smoked for preservation. Wine jars rested in cool storage chambers beneath thick walls. But even there, preservation required constant attention. The Egyptian climate could be cruel. Heat spoiled fresh food quickly. Meat rarely lasted long without drying or salting. Fish caught from the Nile were often cleaned immediately and laid beneath the sun on racks near the water. The smell of drying fish carried across villages during hot afternoons. Strong, salty, heavy in the air. Men repairing fishing nets nearby worked slowly beneath woven shade coverings while flies buzzed endlessly around them. Along the Nile marshes, fishermen stood in shallow reed boats casting nets into dark water before sunrise. Some used harpoons. Others trapped fish in woven baskets. Their catches fed families, workers, priests, and merchants across Egypt. Fish became one of the most important preserved foods for ordinary people. After cleaning the fish, workers rubbed them heavily with salt. Then they dried them under the sun until much of the moisture disappeared. Properly preserved fish could last far longer than fresh catches. The same careful methods were used for many foods. Dates were dried. Figs were pressed into cakes. Herbs hung from ceilings. Garlic and onions were braided together and suspended from rafters where air could move around them. Everything depended on patience and attention. Nothing could be rushed. As the morning sun climbed higher over the fields, the coolness of dawn vanished. Heat pressed down upon villages and farms alike. Workers wrapped linen cloth around their heads while sweat darkened their backs. In storage rooms, the air became still and thick. Scribes continued their work carefully, though their eyes often grew tired by midday. Ink dried quickly in the heat. Flies gathered near open food baskets. Somewhere outside, donkeys brayed loudly while laborers unloaded grain shipments from boats. The sounds of ancient Egypt were never completely silent. Grinding stones, footsteps, hammering wood, children calling to one another, birds over the river, wind moving through reeds, the soft splash of oars. Even at night, some sounds continued, especially near granaries. Guards sometimes watched over larger storage buildings after sunset. Grain theft was taken seriously. Hungry people could become desperate during lean seasons. A single stolen sack might feed an entire family for weeks. So large granaries often stood beside temple complexes or government centers where officials could supervise supplies closely. Temples themselves stored enormous amounts of food. Priests oversaw livestock, grain fields, orchards, fisheries, and workshops connected to temple lands. These institutions fed workers, supported rituals, and helped stabilize communities during poor harvest years. Within temple walls, long rows of storage jars lined cool chambers lit by flickering oil lamps. The air smelled of dust, incense, dried grain, and old stone. Workers moved carefully through narrow corridors carrying baskets upon their shoulders. Some storage jars were taller than a man's waist. Others held oils or wine sealed with clay stoppers marked by official stamps. Everything was counted. Everything recorded. The organization required enormous effort from thousands of ordinary people whose names would never survive history. Women kneading bread dough in hot kitchens. Young boys sweeping spilled grain from storage floors. Old laborers repairing broken baskets beneath shaded courtyards. Boatmen hauling shipments upriver against strong currents. Their lives moved quietly beneath the enormous monuments later generations would remember. And yet those monuments themselves depended entirely upon stored food. The workers who raised stones beneath the desert sun needed daily bread and beer. They needed onions for strength. Dried fish for protein. Water carried carefully in clay jars. Without organized food storage, the great building projects of Egypt would have stopped almost immediately. At midday, workers often rested briefly beneath whatever shade they could find. Palm groves became crowded with tired laborers eating simple meals from linen wrappings. Some dipped bread into beer to soften its hardness. Others shared dried dates or cucumber slices. The heat shimmered above the earth. Even animals grew quiet. Dogs slept beneath carts. Oxen flicked flies with tired tails. The smell of baked mud and hot stone filled the air. Then slowly, when the worst heat began to soften, work resumed again. More grain carried. More jars sealed. More records written. More bread baked. In family homes, evenings brought a different rhythm. Mothers prepared simple meals while children gathered close beside lamps. Smoke drifted upward through roof openings. Outside, neighbors spoke quietly in narrow streets while the desert sky darkened overhead. Storage jars sat silently against walls. A household's future resting inside them. Perhaps enough grain for many months. Perhaps not. Sometimes illness struck suddenly and changed everything. A farmer weakened by fever could not work the fields properly. An injured laborer might lose his share of grain payments. Families depended heavily upon stored food during these difficult times. The elderly especially understood the importance of preparation. Old women inspected jars carefully with experienced eyes. They knew the smell of spoiled grain immediately. They knew how to seal cracks against insects. They knew which foods survived longest through difficult seasons. Knowledge passed quietly through generations. Not through books for most people, but through daily life. Through tired hands teaching younger hands. As night settled once more across the Nile Valley, cool air finally returned to the villages. Workers washed dust from their feet beside water jars before entering homes. Some climbed onto rooftops carrying woven sleeping mats beneath the stars. The river reflected pale moonlight again. Frogs croaked from marshes. Somewhere far away, drums sounded softly from a distant festival near a temple town. And inside countless mud brick homes, food waited silently in darkness. Grain inside clay jars. Dried fish hanging from rafters. Bread cooling on woven trays. Onions stacked in baskets. Small careful protections against hunger. Against uncertainty. Against the long hard seasons that shaped every life beside the Nile. The people of ancient Egypt learned early that survival did not come from strength alone. It came from patience. From routine. From careful storage rooms kept dry through endless summers. From workers rising before dawn day after day beneath the same soft fading stars. And as the night deepened over the quiet river, the warm desert wind moved gently through the sleeping villages, carrying with it the dusty scent of grain that had fed generations for thousands of years. Before the first light touched the eastern edge of the desert, the Nile Valley rested in a strange and peaceful half-darkness. The stars above Egypt still shimmered softly over the black water, though the air near the river already carried the faint promise of another hot day. In the villages beside the fields, sleeping figures shifted quietly beneath linen blankets while oil lamps burned low beside clay walls. A few workers were already awake. Their footsteps sounded soft against packed earth floors as they prepared for another long day of labor. In one small home near the riverbank, an elderly woman sat beside a grinding stone while the rest of her family still slept. Her hands moved slowly but steadily in the dim light, pressing grain into flour with the same rhythm she had known since childhood. The sound was low and constant. Stone against stone. A sound older than memory. Nearby, clay jars lined the wall in careful rows. Some were sealed tightly with mud caps. Others remained partly open, revealing pale grain inside. Each jar carried importance far beyond its simple appearance. A cracked seal or damp floor could destroy precious food little by little without anyone noticing until it was too late. The woman paused occasionally to inspect the grain by touch. Dry. Cool. Safe enough for now. Outside the house, the village remained mostly silent except for the distant sound of river water moving slowly through reeds. A fisherman walked past carrying bundled nets across his shoulder. Somewhere farther away, a donkey snorted softly inside its enclosure. Then slowly, as the horizon became gray, ancient Egypt began another day. The air filled gradually with familiar smells. Wood smoke. Wet clay. Fresh bread. Dust already warming beneath the coming sun. The Nile shaped every hour of life in Egypt. Its yearly flood brought rich black soil that allowed food to grow in a land surrounded by harsh desert. But the river could not guarantee safety. The flood waters rose and fell according to rhythms people never fully controlled. Some years were generous. Others brought worry. Because of this uncertainty, Egyptian life revolved around preparation. Storage rooms became places of quiet importance. Granaries stood like guardians against hunger. Workers spent enormous amounts of time protecting food from heat, moisture, insects, birds, rats, and thieves. Even ordinary families understood techniques passed down through generations. Grain was often dried carefully before storage. Workers spread harvested grain beneath the sun, turning it slowly so moisture could escape. If damp grain entered sealed containers, heat and mold could spread through the supply with terrible speed. In villages across Egypt, people learned to listen carefully to food. A storage jar opening with the wrong smell could bring immediate fear. A sour scent. Rotting grain. Moisture trapped inside. Sometimes families lost entire supplies this way. Then hunger crept slowly into the household. At sunrise, farmers moved toward the fields carrying tools made from wood and stone. The coolness of dawn lasted only briefly, but workers treasured those early hours. Birds crossed the brightening sky over irrigation canals while thin mist hovered near the water. The fields stretched green beside the river. Barley. Emmer wheat. Lentils. Flax. Vegetables growing in narrow garden plots. Much of Egypt's labor centered not simply on growing food, but on protecting it afterward. Harvest itself lasted only part of the cycle. Preservation lasted all year. A farmer near the city of Wazet, known much later as Thebes, might spend weeks repairing his family's storage bins before harvest season arrived. Cracks were dangerous. Holes invited insects. Weak roofs allowed rainwater to seep inside during rare storms. Though Egypt was dry, moisture still threatened food constantly. Especially near the river. Mud brick homes absorbed dampness during flood season. Grain baskets placed directly on floors sometimes spoiled from below. So families lifted supplies onto raised platforms made from wood or packed clay. Cats wandered freely through many Egyptian homes and storage areas. They hunted mice and rats relentlessly. A good cat could protect valuable food stores better than many traps. Children often watched quietly while cats slipped through storage rooms at night, their eyes reflecting faint lamplight. In larger towns, granaries became busy centers of activity during harvest months. Long lines of workers carried sacks through dusty courtyards while scribes recorded every delivery with careful attention. Some granaries were connected directly to government officials or temple estates. The air inside these places felt heavy with grain dust. Laborers coughed while unloading baskets. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Supervisors called instructions over the steady movement of workers climbing ladders and emptying grain into storage chambers. Every sack represented survival. Not only for individual households, but for entire communities. Egyptian rulers understood this deeply. A kingdom without stored grain could collapse quickly during poor floods or drought years. So officials monitored food supplies carefully. Taxes were often collected in grain rather than coins. Large reserves allowed temples and palaces to feed laborers, soldiers, priests, and craftsmen throughout the year. But behind those official systems stood endless ordinary labor. Men carrying loads until their shoulders ached. Women kneading dough before sunrise. Children chasing birds from fields. Boatmen hauling grain northward along the Nile. Their work rarely appeared in carved monuments, yet it held the entire civilization together. By mid-morning, the heat settled heavily across the valley. Sunlight reflected brightly from pale stone walls and dusty roads. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads while sweat gathered along their necks and backs. Inside kitchens, baking ovens made the heat even worse. Egyptian bread ovens were often dome-shaped structures built from clay. Fires burned beneath or inside them until the walls became hot enough for baking. Bakers worked quickly in these suffocating conditions, pressing dough into loaves while smoke drifted upward into the air. Bread itself spoiled quickly in the heat if not eaten soon. Some loaves became hard and dry within days. Yet dry bread still had value. It could be softened in water or beer. Nothing useful was wasted easily. Beer was another essential part of survival. Egyptian beer was thick, nourishing, and far different from modern versions. It provided calories, hydration, and nutrients for workers laboring long hours beneath the sun. Brewing required enormous amounts of grain, so careful storage remained essential for beer production as well. Inside breweries, workers mashed partially baked bread into large vats mixed with water. The smell of fermentation filled the air. Sour and yeasty. Warm from the heat of the day. Clay jars of beer stood cooling in shaded corners while flies buzzed nearby. For many laborers, bread and beer formed the center of daily meals. Simple. Reliable. Filling enough to continue working. Along the Nile, fishermen prepared their catches beneath woven reed shelters. Fish spoiled quickly under Egypt's brutal sun, so preservation began immediately after cleaning. Workers split fish open with bronze knives, rubbed them with salt, and laid them upon drying racks. The smell carried far across the riverbanks, strong and sharp in the heat. Nearby, pelicans drifted on quiet water while children gathered reeds for baskets and mats. Salt itself was precious for food preservation. Egyptians collected natural salt deposits from desert regions and marshes. Salted foods lasted much longer during difficult seasons. Wealthier households sometimes preserved meat this way, though ordinary workers ate meat less often. Most families depended mainly upon grain. The entire rhythm of Egyptian society rose and fell with the condition of stored grain supplies. In some homes, small household shrines stood near storage jars. Families left offerings beside tiny statues or painted images of protective gods. They prayed quietly for healthy harvests, safe food, and protection from sickness. Fear of hunger lived close beneath daily life, even during peaceful years. At noon, the villages became quieter as the heat reached its worst. Workers searched for shade beneath palm trees, beside walls, or inside storage buildings where thick mud brick kept temperatures slightly cooler. The desert beyond the Nile shimmered beneath white sunlight. Almost empty. Still. Endless. But near the river, life continued moving steadily. Boats drifted along canals carrying grain, vegetables, pottery, wood, and livestock between towns. Sailors adjusted linen sails carefully while others rowed against shifting currents. The Nile served as Egypt's great road, connecting distant settlements through water. Some boats transported grain directly into massive royal storage facilities. These places were enormous compared to village granaries. Long corridors lined with storage chambers stretched through thick walls designed to protect supplies from heat and thieves alike. Guards watched entrances carefully. Scribes sat cross-legged with brushes and ink palettes. Officials inspected shipments. The organization required patience beyond measure. Yet even with all this planning, disaster sometimes arrived quietly. A failed flood season could change everything. If Nile waters rose too low, the fields produced less grain. Soon prices increased in markets. Families reduced meals. Workers worried constantly about next year's supply. The poor suffered first. In those years, storage reserves became desperately important. Some communities survived only because grain from previous harvests remained protected inside sealed granaries. At afternoon markets, merchants sold preserved foods from woven baskets and clay trays beneath simple shade coverings. Dried dates glowed dark amber in the sunlight. Garlic hung in braided ropes. Lentils spilled from baskets onto cloth coverings spread across the ground. The market smelled of dust, sweat, spices, and animals. Voices drifted softly through narrow streets. Sandals scraped stone pathways. Children carried water jars carefully through crowded spaces. For many families, market visits required difficult choices. How much grain could be spared for oil? Could dried fish be purchased this week? Would enough remain for planting season? Life beside the Nile demanded constant balancing between present hunger and future survival. As evening approached, workers slowly returned from the fields and workshops. Their bodies carried the exhaustion of heat and labor. Dust clung to their legs and feet. Linen garments hung damp with sweat. Cooking fires appeared one by one across the villages. Smoke rose gently into fading golden light. Inside homes, evening meals were prepared slowly. Bread baked earlier in the day rested beside bowls of lentils, onions, beans, or fish. Sometimes figs or dates were shared among children before sleep. Families often ate sitting close together upon woven mats. Oil lamps flickered against mud brick walls while outside the sky darkened toward deep blue. Storage jars remained close by. Always visible. Always important. A father might inspect them quietly before sleeping. Lifting lids. Checking grain levels. Listening for insects. Some families kept small emergency supplies hidden separately from the main storage area. A sealed jar beneath a sleeping platform. A basket tucked high within roof beams. Tiny protections against uncertain times. Night brought relief from the heat at last. The river breeze cooled the villages gently. Workers climbed onto rooftops carrying mats and blankets. Many slept outside during hotter months beneath open skies filled with stars. Nearby, neighbors spoke softly before drifting into sleep. Somewhere along the riverbank, fishermen repaired nets beside lantern light. The sound of frogs rose from marsh reeds while boats rocked gently against wooden docks. The Nile never truly rested. Even in darkness, food moved quietly along its waters. A grain shipment traveling north. Fish drying beside moonlit shorelines. Dates packed into baskets for distant towns. The entire civilization breathed through this slow, endless movement of food and labor. Deep into the night, temple granaries sometimes remained active. Workers unloaded late shipments beneath torchlight while guards watched silently from nearby gates. The smell of grain dust mixed with smoke and warm stone. Scribes continued counting. Always counting. Numbers scratched carefully onto papyrus. Measurements remembered. Supplies protected. History often remembers the towering monuments of Egypt. The stone temples. The royal tombs. The statues staring endlessly across the desert. But those monuments rested upon something quieter and more fragile. Stored grain inside dark, cool rooms. Bread carried to workers before sunrise. Fish drying beneath hot winds. Hand sealing clay jars against insects. Without those daily acts of preservation, the great cities beside the Nile could never have survived year after year. And so, while kings ordered monuments and priests conducted rituals beneath painted ceilings, ordinary Egyptians continued their slow, careful routines beside the river. Grinding grain before dawn. Repairing storage bins. Drying vegetables in the sun. Inspecting jars by lamplight. Watching the flood waters. Listening for signs of change in the wind and water. Their lives moved with patience shaped by the land itself. The desert taught caution. The river taught preparation. And every evening, when darkness settled softly over the Nile Valley once again, families rested knowing that tomorrow would bring the same quiet cycle of labor, heat, hunger, preservation, and hope beneath the ancient Egyptian sky. Long before sunrise, the Nile Valley rested beneath a sky filled with pale fading stars. The river moved slowly through darkness, smooth and black like polished stone beneath the moonlight. Along the banks, reeds swayed gently in the warm night wind, brushing softly against small wooden boats tied beside muddy shorelines. Most homes remained quiet. Families slept closely together beneath thin linen cloth while the heavy warmth of the night lingered inside mud brick rooms. The air smelled faintly of smoke from cooking fires that had faded hours earlier. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent again. In one narrow village street, an old baker was already awake. He stepped carefully across the cool floor of his small kitchen while carrying a clay lamp in one hand. Shadows moved softly along the walls where baskets of grain rested beside grinding stones and storage jars. The baker paused beside one large jar and lifted its linen cover slowly. Inside, emmer wheat waited in darkness. Dry. Dusty. Safe. For now. He reached inside with practiced hands, feeling the texture carefully. Egyptian workers trusted their senses deeply. The smell of grain, the sound of kernels pouring into baskets, even the weight of a jar could reveal signs of danger before food spoiled completely. Outside, the eastern horizon slowly became lighter. Soon the village would wake. Soon sandals would scrape against dusty roads again. Soon ovens would burn hot beneath the growing sun. The baker poured grain into a woven basket and carried it toward the grinding room where two younger workers would soon arrive. Already the familiar rhythm of labor had begun again, even before daylight touched the river. In ancient Egypt, survival rarely paused. Food preparation moved continuously through every season, every flood cycle, every year. One harvest led immediately into months of storage, preservation, and careful management. Workers could never fully relax. Even during years of abundance, there remained quiet worry beneath daily routines. Would the grain last long enough? Would insects enter the storage jars? Would the next flood arrive properly? These thoughts drifted constantly through Egyptian life like dust carried upon desert winds. As dawn spread across the Nile Valley, cool gray light revealed fields stretching beside the river. Farmers emerged slowly from their homes carrying wooden hoes and baskets. Children followed sleepily behind parents while rubbing tired eyes. Birds gathered above irrigation canals. Palm trees stood dark against the brightening sky. The first sounds of grinding stones began rising from many homes at once. Low, steady, almost comforting. Women bent over stone mills with patient movements shaped by years of repetition. Grain dust settled onto arms and clothing while flour collected slowly in shallow bowls. Nearby, small children carried water jars or gathered dried dung for cooking fires. Inside storage rooms, shadows softened as morning light entered through narrow openings near the ceiling. Clay jars stood quietly against the walls like silent guardians of the household's future. Some jars held grain. Others contained lentils, dried figs, dates, beer, oil, or salt. Many homes smelled slightly different depending on what they stored. One house might carry the sweet scent of dried dates. Another the sharp smell of garlic and onions hanging from rafters. Another the sour warmth of brewing beer. These smells became deeply tied to memory and safety. A well-stocked storage room allowed families to sleep more peacefully during uncertain times. Though peace was never complete. Along the riverbank, fishermen prepared for the day before the sun grew too strong. They checked woven traps, untangled nets, and inspected small reed boats worn smooth by years of use. Some men worked silently while others spoke in low tired voices about water levels and recent catches. The Nile provided food generously, but not effortlessly. Fishing required patience and long hours beneath difficult conditions. Mosquitoes gathered heavily near marshes at dawn. Mud sucked at bare feet near the shorelines. Sharp fish bones cut fingers during cleaning. Still, fish remained one of the most reliable foods for ordinary Egyptians. Especially once preserved. As the morning brightened, women and older children often waited beside drying racks prepared from wood and reeds. Fresh fish were cleaned quickly, rubbed with salt, and arranged carefully beneath the growing sunlight. Flies arrived almost immediately. Workers waved them away with cloth fans while continuing their tasks. The smell near these drying grounds became thick by midday. Salty. Warm. Heavy in the air. Yet this work protected families from hunger later in the year. Dried fish could survive far longer than fresh catches if properly prepared. The same careful attention surrounded nearly every Egyptian food. Dates harvested from palm groves were spread beneath the sun until their skins darkened and wrinkled. Some were pressed tightly into cakes for easier storage and travel. Figs were dried slowly upon woven mats. Herbs hung upside down from roof beams where warm air could move around them. Nothing useful was wasted casually. Even leftover bread held value. Hard stale loaves could be softened in water or beer. Crumbled bread might enter brewing vats for fermentation. Pieces too old for eating were sometimes fed to animals. The line between comfort and hunger remained narrow for many people. By late morning, heat rolled heavily across the fields. Workers wiped sweat from their foreheads while bending low over crops. The desert sun showed little mercy, especially during harvest months. Some farmers wrapped linen cloth around their necks against burning sunlight. Others moved more slowly as the day grew hotter. Bodies became exhausted quickly beneath such conditions. Food storage mattered partly because labor itself demanded enormous energy. The workers of Egypt needed constant nourishment simply to survive the climate. Bread, beer, onions, beans, fish. These foods fueled endless physical effort beneath the heat. Near larger towns, grain deliveries arrived steadily at public granaries through much of the year. Long processions of laborers carried sacks upon their backs while scribes sat beneath shaded awnings recording measurements carefully. The scribes themselves lived quieter but demanding lives. Many spent entire days seated cross-legged with papyrus sheets spread before them. Their fingers stained black from ink. Their backs aching from long hours bent over records. Grain accounting was serious work. A missing shipment might affect hundreds of people. Temple workers, soldiers, stone laborers, boat crews. Everyone depended upon reliable supplies. Within large granaries, the air often felt surprisingly cool compared to the burning streets outside. Thick mud brick walls protected the interior from direct sunlight. Small openings near ceilings allowed limited airflow while keeping out birds and thieves. Workers climbed ladders carrying grain upward to pouring holes leading into storage chambers below. Dust floated through shafts of sunlight cutting across the dim interior. Coughing echoed softly against the walls. Supervisors inspected incoming grain carefully. Was it dry enough? Clean enough? Free from insects? Poor grain threatened entire reserves if mixed carelessly with healthy supplies. In difficult years, anxiety inside these granaries grew heavy. Officials measured reserves again and again. Families watched market prices rise slowly. Conversations became quieter. More serious. The Nile flood determined everything. If floodwaters arrived weekly, fields produced less grain months later. Sometimes the danger revealed itself gradually. At first people simply noticed smaller harvests. Then market baskets grew more expensive. Beer became thinner. Bread smaller. Ordinary workers suffered first. A fisherman might return home carrying less food. A laborer might receive smaller grain payments. A widow living alone might quietly skip meals so children could eat enough. These hardships rarely appeared in temple carvings or royal records, yet they shaped daily life deeply. Still, Egyptians continued preparing carefully whenever possible. Inside homes during the hottest hours of afternoon, women often inspected stored foods while younger children rested nearby. They checked jars for signs of insects or moisture. Grain sometimes had to be turned or moved. Dried foods needed protection from rodents. Cats remained important companions in many households for exactly this reason. Lean desert cats slipped silently through storage rooms hunting mice that threatened valuable supplies. Some families treated them with remarkable affection. A skilled hunter protected not only food, but peace of mind itself. Outside, Village streets became quieter beneath afternoon heat. Even animals slowed their movements. Dogs slept in narrow strips of shade. Donkeys stood motionless beside walls. Chickens pecked lazily at dusty ground. The smell of hot mud brick rose heavily beneath the sun. Yet work never completely stopped. Potters continued shaping storage jars upon spinning wheels. Basket weavers repaired grain baskets using reeds gathered from the Nile marshes. Rope makers twisted fibers beneath simple shelters while sweat dripped slowly from their faces. Entire industries existed simply to support food preservation. Without strong jars, grain spoiled. Without baskets, harvest transport became impossible. Without rope, storage systems weakened. Ancient Egyptian survival depended upon countless interconnected tasks performed quietly by ordinary people every day. As evening slowly approached, shadows lengthened across the valley. The worst heat finally softened. Farmers returned from fields carrying tools upon tired shoulders while fishermen pulled boats onto muddy banks. Cooking fires appeared gradually throughout the villages. Smoke drifted upward into orange evening light. The smell of baking bread returned once again. Inside homes, meals were prepared carefully according to whatever supplies remained available. Some families enjoyed lentil stews flavored with garlic and herbs. Others ate simple bread with onions and beer. Wealthier households sometimes served duck, beef, or sweet cakes flavored with honey. Yet even there, preservation remained important. Meat spoiled quickly in Egypt's climate. Salted and dried foods still played major roles even among the wealthy. In larger estates, servants managed cool storage chambers beneath thick walls where jars of wine and oil rested in darkness. Linen covers protected foods from insects. Records tracked supplies carefully. Still, no household entirely escaped concern over future harvests. As darkness settled over the Nile, evening routine slowed naturally into quietness. Workers washed dust from their feet with cool water poured from clay jars. Families gathered together beneath lamplight while distant sounds drifted softly through narrow streets. A flute somewhere far away. Quiet conversation. The creaking of wooden carts. Water moving gently against riverbanks. Some people climbed to flat rooftops carrying woven sleeping mats. The night air felt cooler there above the crowded houses. Children pointed sleepily toward stars while parents spoke quietly about tomorrow's work. Nearby, storage jars rested silently beneath the darkness. Always present. Always necessary. An older farmer might rise once more before sleeping to inspect his remaining grain supply. He lifted a lamp carefully, checking jar seals one by one. Enough for now. Perhaps enough until next flood season. Perhaps not. Such uncertainty shaped the emotional rhythm of Egyptian life more than monuments or kings ever could. Survival depended less upon glory than upon patience, routine, and careful preparation repeated across generations. Night deepened slowly across the valley. The Nile reflected moonlight in long trembling patterns. Palm trees whispered softly in the warm wind. From distant temple complexes came faint torchlight where guards still watched over great storage buildings filled with grain collected from countless fields. Inside those chambers rested the labor of thousands. Farmers beneath the sun. Women grinding flour. Children carrying water. Boatmen rowing against the current. Workers sealing jars in dusty rooms. Their efforts gathered together quietly inside mud brick walls. And beyond the river valley, the vast desert remained silent beneath the stars, surrounding Egypt like an endless dark sea while life continued carefully along the narrow fertile ribbon beside the Nile. The night over the Nile Valley did not feel empty. It felt full, but in a quiet way, as if the land itself was resting after a long day of work. The wind moved gently through palm leaves, and the river reflected a soft silver light that shifted with every small current. Most villages were still now. Only a few small lamps remained burning inside homes where someone was still awake. Inside one mud brick house near the riverbank, a young man sat beside a low wooden shelf where grain jars were stored. His family had already fallen asleep behind him. The only sound in the room was the slow breathing of tired bodies and the faint crackle of an oil lamp. He reached forward and touched the lid of a clay jar. Carefully. Almost without thinking. This habit had become part of him. Checking food storage at night was not unusual in ancient Egypt. It was a quiet routine shared by many households, especially after long harvest seasons or uncertain floods. He lifted the lid slightly. A soft dry smell rose into the air. Grain. Still safe. Still enough for now. He lowered the lid again and sat back on the woven mat beneath him. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls, the Nile flowed slowly through darkness, carrying with it the memory of fields, farms, and distant villages. Food in ancient Egypt was never just something eaten. It was something watched, protected, remembered. Even in sleep, people carried awareness of it. In larger towns farther along the river, granaries stood like sleeping giants under the night sky. Their thick mud brick walls held vast stores of grain collected from across the land. Inside, the air remained cool and still, holding the faint scent of wheat and dust. Guards walked slowly along the outer walls. Their footsteps were steady, unhurried. They carried simple wooden staffs and small oil lamps that cast narrow circles of light on the ground. Most of their time was quiet, broken only by distant animal sounds or the soft rustle of wind through nearby reeds. Inside the granaries, nothing moved except the occasional shifting of grain as it settled deeper into storage piles. Yet even in the stillness, there was importance. Because what rested inside these buildings determined the survival of entire communities. A failed harvest in one region could be balanced by stored grain in another. A poor flood season could be softened by careful reserves collected in earlier years. Egyptian society depended on this slow accumulation of food, gathered grain by grain, basket by basket, season after season. The system was fragile, but carefully maintained. At dawn, before the sun rose again, workers would return to these granaries. Scribes would continue counting, recording, and adjusting lists. New shipments would arrive from river boats, carried from farms still half asleep in the early morning light. And so the cycle never truly stopped. Back in the villages, the early hours of the morning often brought a soft quiet that felt different from the deep silence of night. It was a living quiet. A waiting quiet. Roosters called faintly. Water jars were lifted from storage corners. Small fires were rebuilt from ash. People began to move again. In one household, a woman prepared bread dough while still half asleep. Her hands moved slowly, pressing flour and water together in a rhythm passed down from her mother and grandmother. The dough felt at first, then warmer as it was kneaded. Nearby, jars of grain stood open. Their contents measured carefully. Nothing wasted. Nothing ignored. Children in nearby rooms stirred awake and sat up quietly on woven mats. One rubbed his eyes while watching his mother work. He already understood, even at a young age, that food was the center of everything. If grain was plentiful, the household felt calm. If grain was low, tension settled into every movement. Across Egypt, this awareness lived in every home. Near the river, fishermen were already preparing their nets again. Some had worked late into the previous night drying fish, but now they returned to the water with slow patience. The Nile did not promise success, but it offered possibility. The boats drifted outward as the sky began to brighten. Reeds brushed softly against wooden sides. Water lapped gently beneath them. On the shore, small piles of dried fish from the previous day's catch were stacked carefully under woven covers to protect them from insects and heat. Even the fish that had already been preserved needed constant attention. Nothing in Egypt was ever fully finished. Everything required maintenance. Everything required care. In the fields, irrigation channels were checked once more. Farmers used wooden tools to guide water into narrow trenches that fed crops growing beside the river. The soil was dark and rich here, but only as long as water continued to flow properly. A broken channel could mean a dry patch of land. A dry patch could mean reduced harvest. And reduced harvest meant smaller storage jars later in the year. So even early in the morning, before the sun became strong, men and women worked along the irrigation systems with quiet focus. The sound of flowing water mixed with soft conversation. Occasionally, someone would pause and look toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to rise. A pale glow spreading slowly across the desert edge. As light returned to the land, storage spaces inside homes became more visible. Jars, baskets, and sealed containers stood in corners and along walls. Some were marked with simple signs or symbols scratched into clay, helping families remember what each container held. Bread flour, barley, lentils, dried fish, beer jars, oil, salt. Each one carried its own importance. A household without grain could not bake bread. Without bread, there was little strength for labor. Without labor, there was no harvest. And without harvest, there was no future storage. Everything circled back to the same simple truth. Food was time. Food was life stretched forward. As morning grew brighter, the heat began to return. It arrived slowly at first, touching rooftops and riverbanks, then spreading across fields and roads. Shadows shortened. The coolness of night faded. Workplaces became active again. In a small workshop near a village center, potters shaped new storage jars from wet clay. Their hands pressed and turned the spinning wheel with steady rhythm. Each jar they formed would one day hold grain, water, beer, or oil. These vessels were essential. Without them, preservation would not be possible. After shaping, the jars were left to dry in the sun. Later, they would be fired in kilns, hardened into strong containers capable of holding food for months or even years. Nearby, basket weavers worked just as carefully. Their fingers moved quickly through reeds gathered from the Nile marshes. These baskets would carry grain during harvest or store dried foods in homes. Everything in this society supported something else. Even tools used for storage required their own network of labor. As the sun climbed higher, the rhythm of daily life settled into its familiar pattern. Heat increased. Work slowed slightly but never stopped. People adjusted their movements to conserve energy. Rest was taken in short moments beneath shade when possible. In storage rooms, the temperature rose too, but thick walls helped protect grain from the worst of it. Inside, the air remained drier than outside, though still warm. A woman stepped into her storage space and carefully rearranged baskets. She checked for insects near the edges of grain containers. She tightened linen coverings. She lifted a jar slightly to feel its weight. Still enough. Still safe. For now. Outside, a child played briefly in the shade of a wall, drawing lines in the dust with a stick. Nearby, an elderly man sat quietly watching the street. His thoughts were slow and steady, shaped by years of experience. He remembered lean seasons. He remembered abundance. He understood how quickly one could turn into the other. And so he valued storage more than anything else. By midday, the heat became heavy again. The air over the fields shimmered, and even distant objects appeared slightly blurred. Workers rested in whatever shade they could find. Some slept briefly. Others ate simple meals of bread and onions. In one shaded courtyard, a group of laborers shared food quietly. A small jar of beer was passed between them. They tore bread into pieces and dipped it into the drink to soften it. The meal was simple, but it carried them through the day. Nearby, a cat lay stretched out in the shade, eyes half closed, waiting patiently for movement among storage baskets where mice might appear. Even in rest, protection never fully stopped. As afternoon slowly shifted toward evening again, the valley began to cool. Workers returned from fields and workshops. Boats came back along the river carrying supplies. Smoke began rising from cooking fires across villages. Inside homes, families gathered once more. Food was taken from storage. Bread was baked. Dried fish was softened. Lentils were boiled. The cycle continued without interruption. And as night approached again, the Nile reflected the first stars returning to the sky. The same quiet rhythm settled over the land. Sleep would come soon. But even in sleep, the memory of storage remained. Jars against walls. Grain beneath clay lids. Food waiting for tomorrow. Food waiting for survival. And the river, moving endlessly through darkness, carried all of it forward into another day that would begin again in silence beneath the ancient Egyptian sky. Night returned again to the Nile Valley the way it always did, slowly, without urgency, as if the land itself was exhaling after another long day. The heat of the afternoon still lingered in the mud brick walls of homes, but above the rooftops the air had begun to cool. A soft wind moved through the palms near the river, carrying the smell of water and damp earth. Inside the villages, lamps flickered behind small windows. Most people were already resting. Some lay on woven mats on rooftops where the night air felt easier to breathe. Others slept inside thick-walled rooms where the heat faded only gradually. Children curled beside parents. Elderly men and women rested quietly, their bodies shaped by years of labor and routine. In one home near a narrow irrigation canal, a young girl remained awake for a little longer than the rest of her family. She sat near a storage corner where clay jars stood in careful rows along the wall. She had been told not to disturb them. But she liked to look at them. Each jar felt like a quiet promise. Food meant safety. Safety meant sleep without fear. Even if she did not fully understand it yet, she felt it deeply. She reached out and touched one jar lightly. It was cool against her fingers. Inside, grain waited in darkness. Outside, the Nile moved slowly under the stars, unchanged by human worry or hope. It had seen generations come and go, fields rise and fall, floods arrive and retreat. And still it continued, steady and patient. Food storage in ancient Egypt existed because of this river, but also because of its uncertainty. The Nile was generous, yet never completely predictable. It gave life, but demanded attention in return. Every household understood that balance. In larger towns along the river, granaries remained active even during the night. Not in loud or hurried ways, but in quiet ongoing maintenance. Guards patrolled slowly. Doors were checked. Seals inspected. Inside, the stored grain rested in massive piles or deep chambers carved into thick structures. The air inside was still and heavy, carrying the faint scent of dried wheat and dust that clung to clothing and skin. A lone worker walked through one of these storage corridors holding a small lamp. His footsteps echoed softly. He paused occasionally to examine sections of grain. Sometimes he reached out and let a small amount slip through his fingers. This was not careless. It was routine. Grain had to be monitored even in rest, as insects or moisture could begin silently, without warning. Everything depended on noticing small changes early. A slightly different smell. A slight clumping of grain. A faint sign of dampness near the edges. These details mattered more than grand plans or powerful commands. Survival in ancient Egypt was often decided in these quiet observations. Outside the granary walls, the night air felt cooler. The river reflected moonlight in long shifting patterns. Boats rocked gently against wooden posts. A fisherman sat awake beside his net, repairing a small tear he had discovered earlier in the day. His hands moved slowly in the dim light. Thread passing through wet fibers. Repairing what would be needed again tomorrow. Across the water, distant village lights shimmered faintly. The entire landscape felt connected by small continuous acts of care. Not one moment of survival, but thousands of small moments layered together. In the early hours before dawn, when the world was at its quietest, storage work often felt most important. This was the time when mistakes could be noticed without distraction. When jars could be checked in silence. When grain could be inspected carefully. A woman in a small household storage room knelt beside her supplies with a low lamp beside her. She had woken without urgency, as many experienced people did, sensing the need to check what the day might bring. She opened one container and leaned closer. The smell told her everything she needed to know. Dry grain. No dampness. No sign of insects. She nodded slightly, more to herself than anyone else, and closed the jar again with careful hands. Then she moved to the next. In this way, food was not only stored but actively maintained, as if it were alive in its own quiet way. Because in truth, it was. If neglected, it decayed. If protected, it sustained life for months. Sometimes even years. As dawn approached again, the sky above the Nile began to shift from deep black to soft blue-gray. Birds stirred in the reeds. A distant rooster called out, followed by others across the village. People began to wake. Not suddenly, but gradually, as if the world itself was remembering movement. Inside kitchens, small fires were started once more. Smoke rose gently into the cooling morning air. Bread dough from the previous day was shaped again, ready for baking. Grain was measured carefully from storage jars. The rhythm continued. Always the same. Always necessary. Along the river, fishermen prepared nets once more. Their boats sat half in water, half on mud from the night tide. The Nile carried a faint chill in the early morning, though it would not last long. A man pushed his boat forward with a slow pole, guiding it into deeper water. Another followed. Soon several small boats drifted outward, forming quiet patterns across the river surface. They did not speak much. There was no need. Fishing was a task of patience more than conversation. Meanwhile, in fields closer to the riverbanks, irrigation channels were checked again. The water had shifted slightly overnight. Small adjustments were made with wooden tools, redirecting flow into narrow paths that fed crops. Even small changes mattered. Too much water in one place could damage young plants. Too little could weaken the harvest months later. And that harvest, once again, would determine how full storage jars became in the future. By mid-morning, the sun had fully returned. Light spread across the valley, bright and steady. Shadows shortened beneath palm trees and walls. Heat began its slow rise again. Work resumed everywhere. In storage workshops, potters continued shaping containers that would later hold grain. Some jars were large enough to store enough food for an entire household for weeks. Others were smaller, meant for daily use or special ingredients. Each vessel carried purpose. Each one supported survival. In a nearby courtyard, a group of workers repaired baskets. Old grain containers were strengthened with new reeds. Broken edges were rewoven. Handles replaced. Nothing was discarded unless absolutely necessary. Even damaged tools could often be restored. This habit of repair extended beyond objects. It shaped thinking. Waste was dangerous in a land where resources were tightly connected to survival. Inside homes, women and men continued to manage food supplies carefully. Some jars were moved into cooler corners of rooms. Others were elevated slightly to avoid dampness. Linen covers were adjusted to block insects. A child watched quietly as an adult lifted a lid and checked grain. This act would become part of their memory. Something learned without instruction. Something understood through repetition. Food required attention. Not once, but constantly. As the sun climbed higher, activity slowed slightly under the growing heat. People sought shade where possible. Animals became still. The village entered a quieter phase of midday rest and reduced movement. Inside storage rooms, temperatures rose, but thick mud brick walls continued to provide protection. Grain remained safe as long as conditions were monitored. A man entered a granary storage space carrying a small wooden tablet. He recorded notes about incoming supplies. His handwriting was careful, each symbol representing a precise amount of grain. Numbers mattered deeply here. They represented trust. Trust that food existed in enough quantity to support many lives. Outside, the sound of hammering continued faintly from a workshop where workers repaired wooden frames used in transport carts. These carts carried grain between villages, markets, and storage facilities. Without them, distribution would slow. And without distribution, some regions might suffer while others held surplus. Egypt depended on balance. A balance between storage and movement. Between harvest and distribution. Between river and desert. By late afternoon, the heat began to soften again. A shift always came, subtle but noticeable. The light changed. The wind returned slightly. Shadows lengthened. People began to move more freely again. In kitchens, evening meals were prepared. Grain taken from storage earlier in the day was now transformed into bread. Vegetables were cooked. Dried fish was softened in water. Lentils simmered slowly over low fires. The smell of food spread through villages once more. A comforting signal that another day had been sustained successfully. Children gathered near homes, playing briefly in the cooling air. Adults sat outside resting tired bodies while watching the sky change color. Some spoke softly about the flood season. Others about repairs needed for storage rooms. Others about nothing in particular, enjoying the rare quiet between labor and sleep. Inside homes, jars were checked again briefly before nightfall. Not out of fear, but habit. A final glance before rest. Still full enough. Still safe. Still enough for tomorrow. As evening arrived, the river reflected deep orange and gold tones from the setting sun. Boats returned slowly along the water. Fishermen pulled nets back in, carrying the day's catch to shore. Some fish would be eaten fresh. Most would be preserved. Salt rubbed carefully into flesh. Sun-dried on racks. Stored for later weeks. The same process repeated across countless households. Nothing rushed. Nothing wasted. Night approached once more, wrapping the valley in softness. Lamps lit again inside homes. Cooking fires dimmed. Conversations lowered. The Nile continued its slow movement through darkness, as it always had and always would within memory. And in every home along its banks, behind walls of mud brick and reed, food rested quietly in storage jars, baskets, and sealed containers. Grain for bread. Fish for future meals. Dried fruits for distant days. Each one a small defense against uncertainty. Each one a quiet act of preparation repeated across generations. And as the stars returned above the river once again, the cycle of ancient Egyptian life settled into its familiar rhythm, waiting for another morning that would arrive gently, without hurry, just as all mornings did in the land beside the Nile. The night settled more deeply now, as if the world had drifted further into itself. Along the Nile, darkness was never truly empty. It was filled with soft movement, with quiet life continuing even when human activity slowed. The river kept flowing. Always the same direction. Always the same slow breath through the land. In the villages, most lamps had been extinguished. Only a few remained, glowing behind small shutters or open doorways where someone still sat awake for a moment longer before sleep finally took them. Inside one modest home near the edge of a field, an older man sat alone beside his storage corner. His family slept behind him, spread across woven mats that covered most of the floor space. The air was still warm from the day, but slowly cooling with the night wind that slipped through small gaps in the mud brick walls. He reached for a clay jar without lighting a lamp. He already knew its shape by memory. His hand moved slowly, carefully, as if the jar itself could speak. When he opened it slightly, the faint scent of grain rose into the air. He did not need to see it to understand its condition. After so many years, he could feel it in the silence of the room, in the way the air changed just a little when food was safe. He closed the lid again. Softly. Carefully. And sat still for a moment longer. Not worried. Not joyful. Just aware. In ancient Egypt, this awareness of stored food became part of a person's inner rhythm. It lived beneath thought, like breathing. People did not always speak about it, but they carried it with them everywhere they went. Because food storage was never just about the present. It was always about what came after. Across the river, beyond the sleeping fields, larger granaries rested beneath the night sky like silent stone bodies. Their walls were thick enough to hold back heat during the day and protect grain during long seasons. Inside, everything was arranged with careful intention. Upper layers for newer grain. Lower chambers for older supplies. Separate rooms for different types of food. Every section had meaning. Every container had purpose. A guard walked slowly along the outer wall of one of these storage complexes. His footsteps were unhurried, almost blending into the night itself. He carried a small lamp that barely pushed back the darkness beyond a few steps. He stopped occasionally. Listening. Not for noise, but for absence of it. Because in a place filled with valuable food, silence could sometimes be the most important sound of all. A missing sound could mean a missing presence. A broken seal. A disturbance. A problem forming quietly before it became visible. But tonight, everything was still. The river nearby reflected faint starlight, broken into thin trembling lines by gentle currents. Somewhere far off, a boat moved slowly along the water, its shape barely visible against the dark surface. Only the faintest sound of oars reached the shore before fading again. Life did not stop in Egypt at night. It simply became quieter. More hidden. More patient. Inside homes, families slept in layers of warmth gathered from the day. Even in rest, their bodies remained connected to the labor of food preparation. Muscles shaped by grinding grain. Hands hardened by harvesting. Skin marked by sun and wind. Dreams often carried fragments of daily work. Fields. Jars. Bread. Water flowing through canals. Not as symbols, but as memory repeating itself in sleep. Before dawn approached again, the air grew slightly cooler. This was the deepest part of night, when even insects quieted and the river seemed to slow its sound. In a small household storage room, a young woman woke briefly without opening her eyes fully. She sat up, adjusting the linen cloth around her shoulders. Something had drawn her attention, not as fear, but as habit. She listened. Nothing unusual. Still, she stood. Her feet touched the cool packed earth floor as she moved toward the storage corner. She did not carry a lamp. She did not need one. Her hands already knew where everything was. One jar. Then another. She touched the lids lightly. Each one familiar. Each one part of the household's quiet security. When she was satisfied, she returned to her mat and lay back down, drifting once more into sleep as easily as she had woken. This was how trust in stored food was maintained. Not through fear, but through repetition. Through checking. Through routine so deeply learned it no longer felt like effort. It simply was. By the time the eastern sky began to pale again, birds had already started to stir. Their calls were soft at first, scattered across the riverbanks, then gradually growing stronger as the light returned. The Nile Valley shifted slowly from night into morning. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But gently, like a long breath being released. Inside homes, grain jars were opened again. Not because anything had changed, but because a new day required preparation. Flour would be ground. Dough would be kneaded. Bread would be baked. The same cycle continued. The same movement from storage to labor to consumption and back again. In a riverside village, a group of workers gathered early near a small storage building that belonged to a local estate. They stood quietly while waiting for instructions. Some carried ropes. Others held baskets. A few adjusted cloths wrapped around their heads to prepare for heat that would arrive later. The storage doors were opened slowly. A darker, cooler air drifted out from inside. The workers stepped forward. Inside, rows of grain containers stood in organized lines. Some were tall clay jars sealed with hardened mud caps. Others were woven baskets reinforced with cloth covers. The smell was dry and earthy, like stored seasons compressed into one place. The workers began their tasks without speaking much. Lifting. Carrying. Transferring grain into sacks for distribution. Everything was measured. Everything accounted for. A scribe sat nearby on a low stool, recording each movement with careful strokes of ink onto papyrus. His eyes moved constantly between numbers and workers, ensuring that nothing was missed. In this quiet cooperation between labor and record, entire communities depended on survival. Not just the storage of food, but the trust that it was stored correctly. Outside, the sun had begun to rise higher, turning the river into a bright ribbon of shifting light. Boats began moving again, carrying supplies toward other villages. The sound of water against wood mixed with distant voices calling across the shore. In the fields, irrigation channels were checked once more. Farmers guided water carefully, adjusting small wooden barriers. The soil absorbed it slowly, darkening in patches. Crops leaned slightly as if responding to the return of movement and care. Everything in this world depended on timing. Too early, and grain would not grow. Too late, and harvest would weaken. Too careless, and storage would fail. By mid-morning, the heat began to rise again, and with it came the familiar slowing of movement. People sought shade where they could. Work continued, but more deliberately, conserving energy for the long hours ahead. Inside storage rooms, the temperature increased slightly, but remained stable enough to protect grain. Thick walls absorbed the worst of the heat, holding it away from the inner supplies. A man stood in a granary doorway watching dust drip through sunlight beams. He lifted a hand briefly, feeling the warmth on his skin. Then he turned back inside, where the work continued without pause. Further along the river, smaller households performed their own quiet checks. A mother lifted a basket lid. A father inspected grain for signs of insects. A child watched carefully, learning without realizing it. These moments were not lessons spoken aloud. They were lived. Passed down through repetition. Through presence. As the afternoon slowly matured, the village entered a calmer rhythm again. Some people rested. Others continued light work in shaded areas. The sound of tools tapping wood or clay became softer, more spaced out. In one corner of a courtyard, a cat lay curled beside stacked storage baskets, its ears twitching occasionally. It was not asleep, but resting in alert stillness, always ready to move if needed. Even animals understood the importance of stored food. The day moved forward gently, without urgency. And as it did, the awareness of food storage remained quietly present in every household, every movement, every decision. Not spoken. Not announced. Just lived. And beneath all of it, the Nile continued its slow and endless flow, carrying the memory of every harvest, every flood, every season of careful preparation, while the people along its banks continued to store, to protect, and to wait for the next quiet morning that would arrive just as softly as all the others before it. The evening breeze moved softly across the Nile, cooling the edges of the long hot day. Palm trees whispered against the darkening sky while thin ripples crossed the surface of the river, catching the last traces of fading sunlight. Along the shore, fishermen pulled their boats onto the muddy banks one by one. Their movements were slow now. The strength of the afternoon had faded from their arms, replaced by the deep heaviness that came after many hours beneath the sun. Nets were lifted carefully. Fish sorted quietly. Nothing wasted. A few fresh fish would be eaten tonight while the rest would begin the familiar process of preservation before darkness fully settled across the valley. Near the shore, flat drying racks waited beneath open air. Men cleaned fish with bronze knives while nearby children carried bowls of salt from storage baskets kept beneath simple reed shelters. The smell of river water mixed with the sharp scent of fresh fish and warm mud. One older fisherman worked silently beside his son. The boy was still learning how much salt to use. Too little and the fish would spoil. Too much and the flesh would harden beyond comfort. The father showed him slowly, patiently, rubbing the salt into the fish with careful hands worn rough from years of labor. These lessons were not written down. They passed from one pair of hands to another. One season to the next. One generation to the next. As darkness deepened, the drying racks became quiet rows of pale shapes beneath the stars. The fish would remain there through much of the night and into tomorrow's heat, slowly losing moisture beneath sun and wind. Nearby, the fishermen gathered for their evening meal. Bread was shared across woven mats. A clay jar of beer passed slowly between tired hands. The men spoke softly about river currents, changing water levels, and rumors of flood conditions farther south. Everything eventually returned to the flood. It shaped every conversation, every plan, every worry. Without proper flooding, fields weakened. Without strong fields, granaries emptied. And so the river lived constantly in the minds of Egyptian people, even while they slept. Farther inland, beyond the riverbank, village homes glowed softly with oil lamps. Cooking fires crackled inside small courtyards where women prepared the evening meal using ingredients taken carefully from storage jars. A woman reached into a basket of onions hanging from the ceiling beams. Nearby, lentils simmered slowly in a clay pot while flat bread baked against the hot inner walls of an oven. The room smelled warm and comforting. Smoke, garlic, grain. A faint sweetness from dried dates resting nearby. Children waited sleepily beside the cooking fire while their mother moved carefully through the familiar motions of preparing food. She knew exactly how much grain could be used tonight without reducing tomorrow's supply too quickly. This quiet measuring happened constantly inside Egyptian homes. Not through written calculations, but through instinct shaped by years of watching storage jars rise and fall with the seasons. Some nights there was enough to feel comfortable. Other nights required caution. A little less grain. A thinner soup. One fewer loaf. The balance was always changing. Outside, the village streets slowly emptied as darkness spread fully across the land. Donkeys rested quietly near walls. Dogs wandered slowly through narrow paths searching for scraps. Above the rooftops, stars stretched clearly across the sky untouched by any distant city lights. Ancient Egypt at night could feel deeply peaceful. But beneath that peace lived constant preparation. Inside one home, an elderly grandmother sat beside a small storage room while repairing a torn grain sack by lamplight. Her fingers moved carefully through the thick woven fibers. Every container mattered. A damaged sack could spill grain. Spilled grain attracted insects and rats. Small problems became larger ones very quickly. The old woman understood this deeply. She had lived through poor flood years before. Years when families guarded every handful of grain with quiet seriousness. As she worked, she occasionally glanced toward the jars lined against the wall. Some were large and nearly full. Others had already lowered noticeably since harvest season. The sight brought both comfort and worry together. Enough remained for now. But the next flood still felt far away. Late into the evening, large temple granaries remained dimly active beneath torchlight. Workers unloaded final shipments arriving by boat while scribes checked inventory records beside low wooden tables. The temples of Egypt were not only places of worship. They were centers of storage, labor, farming, and distribution. Huge amounts of food passed through their walls every season. Temple lands produced grain, vegetables, fruit, fish, and livestock that supported priests, workers, craftsmen, and surrounding communities. Their granaries stood among the largest in Egypt, towering above nearby buildings with thick walls designed to protect supplies from heat and theft. Inside one temple storage hall, rows of enormous clay jars stretched into darkness beyond the reach of torchlight. Workers moved quietly between them carrying baskets upon their shoulders. Sweat shone along their arms even at night. The air remained warm and dry inside the storage chambers. Dust floated slowly through torch smoke. At the far end of the hall, a scribe paused to flex his aching fingers before returning to his records. His work demanded long hours of careful attention. A missing shipment or incorrect count could affect many people depending upon temple food supplies. He dipped his reed brush into dark ink and continued writing. One line after another. Grain from western fields. Barley from southern farms. Fish preserved near the delta marshes. Everything documented. Everything watched. Back in the villages, sleep slowly settled over households one by one. Rooftops filled with resting bodies beneath the warm night air. Some families slept outdoors to escape the trapped heat inside mud brick rooms. The sounds of the village softened. Low conversation faded. Cooking fires dimmed. Only the occasional cry of a night bird drifted through the darkness. Inside storage rooms, grain rested silently behind sealed lids and woven coverings. Dried herbs hung motionless from roof beams. Clay jars cooled slowly after the day's heat. These quiet rooms held more than food. They held time itself. Every store jar represented days of labor already completed and days of survival still waiting ahead. In the deepest part of night, the Nile Valley became wonderfully still. The river reflected moonlight in pale silver bands while reeds moved gently along the shoreline. A boatman drifting northward adjusted his small sail beneath the stars. His cargo consisted mostly of grain sacks stacked carefully beneath linen coverings to protect them from moisture and insects. He traveled slowly through the darkness. No hurry. The river itself decided the pace. Trade boats moved constantly along the Nile carrying preserved foods between villages, temple complexes, and crowded cities. Some carried grain. Others transported salted fish, beer jars, oil, dates, figs, or bundles of onions braided together with reeds. Food connected every corner of Egyptian life. And preservation made that connection possible across distance and time. Without storage methods, food could not safely travel far beneath the Egyptian heat. The boatman glanced toward the riverbank where small villages rested quietly beneath the moonlight. From a distance, the homes appeared almost part of the earth itself, their mud brick walls blending softly into the dark landscape. Somewhere inside those sleeping homes, families rested beside storage jars that determined whether tomorrow would feel calm or uncertain. As the hours passed, cooler air settled more heavily across the valley. Workers sleeping on rooftops shifted beneath linen blankets. Children curled closer beside parents. Dogs rested with noses tucked beneath tails. Then slowly, almost invisibly, the eastern horizon began changing once again. Night loosened its hold. The first faint grayness appeared beyond the desert. Another morning approached. Inside one small bakery near the center of a riverside town, a young worker woke before everyone else. He rubbed tired eyes and sat quietly for a moment listening to the silence around him. Then he stood. The bakery smelled faintly of old flour and warm clay ovens. Storage baskets lined one wall while grain jars rested in shadow near the doorway. The young man lifted one heavy jar carefully and poured grain into a grinding basin. The sound echoed softly through the quiet room. Soon others would wake. Soon the ovens would burn hot again. Soon bread would fill the streets with its familiar smell. Outside, fishermen would return to the river. Farmers would walk toward the fields. Scribes would reopen storage records. Workers would carry grain through dusty courtyards beneath the rising sun. And all across the Nile Valley, the ancient endless rhythm of storing food and surviving another day would begin again, calm and steady beneath the slowly brightening Egyptian sky. The first light of morning spread slowly across the Nile Valley, soft and pale at first, touching the tops of palm trees and the edges of sleeping rooftops. The river reflected the changing sky in long bands of silver and muted gold while thin mist hovered low above the water. For a few quiet moments, the land felt suspended between sleep and labor. Then the sounds began again. A rooster calling from a courtyard. Sandals brushing packed earth. The creak of a wooden door opening. A grinding stone beginning its steady rhythm somewhere inside a nearby home. The village awakened gently, as it always did. Inside a narrow mud brick house near the edge of the fields, a mother sat cross-legged before a grinding stone while her youngest child slept beside her. Her movements were slow and practiced, pressing grain forward with both hands while flour gathered gradually in the shallow basin below. The room smelled of dust and warm clay. Storage jars stood lined against the wall behind her, their rounded shapes catching faint morning light. Some were sealed tightly with mud caps. Others remained open for daily use. The woman glanced toward them often without fully realizing it. After many years, watching stored food had become almost automatic, woven quietly into every part of life. Outside, the morning air still carried a little coolness from the night before. Farmers walked toward irrigation canals carrying wooden tools over their shoulders while fishermen moved down narrow river paths toward their boats. No one hurried. The heat would come soon enough. There was wisdom in moving slowly during the early hours. Near the riverbank, a group of young boys helped unload baskets from a small grain boat that had arrived before sunrise. The sacks were heavy, and dust rose around their feet as they carried them toward a nearby storage building. An older supervisor stood nearby watching carefully. Not harshly. Simply attentively. Every sack mattered. Each one represented labor already completed beneath long weeks of sunlight. Fields harvested. Grain dried. Bundles carried. Crops protected from birds, insects, and flood damage. Now the grain entered another stage of its life. Storage. Inside the granary, the air felt cooler than outside. Thick mud brick walls softened the growing heat of the morning sun. Workers climbed wooden ladders while carrying baskets upon their backs, pouring grain carefully into deeper storage chambers below. The sound of falling grain filled the room. Soft. Dry. Almost like rain. Dust floated through beams of sunlight entering from small openings high above. Some workers wrapped cloth around their mouths to keep from breathing too much dust, though it settled into their skin and hair anyway. A scribe sat cross-legged near the entrance recording the deliveries one by one. His reed brush moved steadily across papyrus sheets while he occasionally paused to stretch aching fingers. Long hours spent writing left many scribes with stiff backs and tired eyes. Yet their work was essential. Without records, confusion could spread quickly. Without careful counting, grain reserves could disappear unnoticed. The stability of entire communities rested partly upon these quiet calculations made day after day in shaded corners beside towering storage rooms. Outside, sunlight spread farther across the valley. The coolness faded slowly. Women swept courtyards with reed brooms while children carried water jars from communal wells. Bakers prepared ovens for the first bread of the morning. Soon the smell drifted through the streets. Warm grain. Smoke. Fresh bread crust darkening against heated clay. For many Egyptians, bread remained the center of nearly every meal. Wealthier households might add honey, fruit, or fine flour, but ordinary workers usually ate simpler loaves made from barley or emmer wheat. Some bread was eaten fresh. Some dried hard for later use. Some crumbled into brewing vats for beer production. Nothing useful was wasted carelessly. Inside homes, food preparation unfolded beside storage constantly. A woman might reach into one jar for lentils, another for grain flour, another for dried herbs hanging nearby. These movements formed part of a rhythm repeated thousands of times across Egypt each day. A hand lifting a lid. A basket lowered carefully. A clay seal inspected. Small gestures repeated so often they became almost invisible. Yet they held entire lives together. By mid-morning, the sun climbed higher, and heat began pressing more heavily across the land. The dusty roads brightened beneath harsh light while insects buzzed lazily through the warming air. In the fields, workers bent low beside irrigation trenches guiding water into rows of crops. The Nile flood had long since retreated, leaving behind fertile dark soil that cracked quickly if left without water. Farmers understood timing deeply. Too much water harmed roots. Too little weakened harvests. And weak harvests meant anxious nights beside half-empty storage jars. The connection between river and granary remained constant in everyone's mind. Near one canal, an elderly farmer rested briefly beneath the shade of a date palm. Sweat darkened his linen clothing while he drank slowly from a clay water jar. Beside him sat a small woven basket containing dried figs and bread saved from the morning meal. Simple food. Carefully preserved food. The kind that sustained ordinary life through long days beneath the Egyptian sun. Farther north along the Nile, larger cities carried a different atmosphere. Streets there were more crowded. Workshops louder. Markets filled with merchants calling softly beneath shade coverings stretched across narrow roads. But even in the busiest places, storage remained central to daily life. Market stalls displayed preserved foods in woven trays and baskets. Salted fish stacked beside onions and garlic. Dates pressed into dark cakes. Lentils poured into clay bowls. Jars of oil sealed carefully against dust and insects. The smell of these markets lingered heavily in the warm air. Spices. Dry grain. Animals. Smoke from nearby cooking fires. Human sweat beneath the heat. Merchants knew exactly how quickly food could spoil if left exposed too long. Shade coverings mattered. Covered baskets mattered. Clay containers mattered. Preservation shaped every corner of Egyptian commerce. At midday, much of the valley slowed beneath the crushing heat. The brightest hours forced workers into shorter movements and quieter routines. Some rested beneath woven shelters. Others gathered inside thicker buildings where shade provided slight relief. Inside granaries, labor continued carefully despite the heat. Workers inspected stored grain for signs of moisture or insects. Long wooden tools were sometimes used to shift grain deeper inside storage piles, allowing trapped heat to escape. Spoilage was always feared, especially during humid periods near flood season. A single damaged section could spread trouble silently through an entire reserve if ignored too long. So Egyptian storage work required constant attention. Not dramatic effort. Quiet vigilance. In one temple storage complex, priests oversaw inventories beside cool stone corridors lined with enormous jars. The walls here were decorated with painted scenes showing harvests, offerings, and rows of grain being carried toward storage chambers. Even sacred spaces reflected the importance of preservation. The temples themselves consumed enormous amounts of food each year. Priests, laborers, musicians, servants, craftsmen, guards, and scribes all depended upon carefully managed supplies. Temple kitchens baked bread daily in large clay ovens while workers prepared beer in broad fermentation vats nearby. The smell inside these compounds could become thick and heavy by afternoon. Warm yeast. Smoke. Oil. Boiling grain. Outside the kitchens, servants carried baskets of onions and dried fish through shaded courtyards while cats wandered quietly between storage rooms hunting mice. The cats moved lazily during the heat, though their importance remained understood by everyone. Grain attracted rodents constantly, and a skilled hunting cat could protect food supplies more effectively than many traps. By late afternoon, shadows began stretching across the valley once again. Workers in the fields straightened slowly, stretching sore backs before gathering tools for the walk home. The air softened little by little. A breeze returned from the river. Dust drifted gently along the roads as donkeys carried empty grain sacks back toward villages. Inside homes, evening routines began quietly. Cooking fires were rebuilt. Water jars refilled. Storage baskets opened once more for the final meal of the day. A mother removed dried fish from a hanging rack while her daughter kneaded bread dough nearby. The room glowed softly with orange firelight. Outside, neighbors spoke in low voices while sitting beside narrow streets. Children laughed briefly before sleepiness overtook them. The village slowly relaxed into evening. Inside storage corners, grain jars stood patiently in shadow. Still enough for now. Still guarding tomorrow. As darkness settled fully across the Nile Valley again, the river reflected stars in long trembling patterns while frogs called softly from marsh reeds. Somewhere far away, a boatman guided a grain shipment northward beneath moonlight. Elsewhere, a tired scribe finished the final inventory records of the day. And in countless homes scattered beside the ancient river, families rested beside carefully stored food that carried them gently from one season into the next beneath the calm endless sky of Egypt. The Nile moved quietly beneath the moonlight, dark and slow beside the sleeping land. Along its banks, reeds bent gently in the night breeze, brushing against one another with soft whispering sounds that drifted across the water. The villages beside the river had grown still again. Most fires had faded to dim orange embers. Most voices had disappeared into sleep. Only the river remained awake. And the storage rooms. Inside homes throughout Egypt, jars and baskets rested silently in the darkness, holding the careful work of many months. Grain waited beneath sealed lids. Dried onions hung in bundles from wooden beams. Clay jars of beer cooled slowly against mud brick walls. These quiet rooms carried a strange feeling at night. Peaceful. But serious. Even sleeping families remained connected to the food beside them. A household could rest more deeply when storage jars were full. And when supplies became low, sleep itself sometimes felt lighter, more uncertain. An older farmer in a small riverside village woke briefly sometime after midnight. He sat up slowly upon his woven mat, listening to the night air moving through the rooftop sleeping area. Nearby, his wife and grandchildren remained asleep. The old man stared quietly toward the storage corner near the stair opening leading back inside the house. Though he could not see the jars clearly in the darkness, he knew exactly where each one stood. One nearly full of barley. Another half full of lentils. A smaller jar with dried figs. Enough for now. He lowered himself back onto the mat and closed his eyes again while the Nile breeze passed softly over the rooftops. Farther south along the river, a boat drifted through darkness carrying grain collected from villages after the harvest. The sail hung loosely in the weak night wind while two boatmen guided the vessel carefully through the quiet water. The cargo rested beneath linen coverings to protect it from moisture. Even during transport, preservation required attention. The men aboard the boat spoke very little. One adjusted a rope while the other watched the riverbank slide slowly past beneath the moonlight. palm groves, mud brick homes, dark irrigation canals. The whole landscape seemed suspended in stillness. Trade along the Nile often continued through the night during hotter seasons. The cooler air made travel easier for both people and animals. Boats carrying grain, oil, dried fish, beer jars, and baskets of dates moved steadily between villages, temple estates, and crowded cities farther north. Without the river, Egypt could never have supported such large populations. And without stored food, the river alone would never have been enough. Long before dawn, activity quietly began again in some parts of the valley. Bakers rose early to prepare ovens before the heat of day returned. In one small bakery, 2 workers carried baskets of grain from a storage room while oil lamps flickered softly against smoke-darkened walls. The bakery smelled warm even before the fires were lit. Old flour, ash, dry grain dust. One worker knelt beside a grinding stone and began crushing grain into flour with slow, powerful movements. The sound echoed softly through the room. Stone against stone. Steady. Ancient. Nearby, another worker inspected grain carefully before pouring it into the basin. Bakers learned quickly that poor grain created poor bread. Dampness, insects, or mold could ruin entire batches. So even before sunrise, food preservation remained part of the work. Outside, the eastern horizon slowly softened from black into gray-blue. Birds began stirring near the riverbanks while fishermen prepared nets beside narrow wooden docks. The cool air would not last long. Everyone understood this. Workers moved carefully during these early hours, taking advantage of every moment before the sun became harsh. In a farming village farther inland, women entered household storage rooms carrying woven baskets and clay bowls. Morning meals had to be prepared before laborers left for the fields. One woman lifted the lid from a grain jar and paused for a moment. The smell remained clean and dry. Good. She scooped grain into a basket while nearby a small child watched sleepily from the doorway. The child had seen these same movements every morning since birth. The lifting of lids. The measuring of grain. The careful resealing of jars afterward. Without formal lessons, children learned the importance of storage simply by living beside it. Food was never treated casually. Even small amounts mattered. As dawn spread fully across the Nile Valley, the fields brightened beneath golden light. Irrigation canals reflected the sky while farmers walked narrow dirt paths carrying tools upon their shoulders. The floodwaters had long since withdrawn, leaving rich dark soil behind. Yet already workers worried quietly about future seasons. Would the next flood arrive properly? Would the river rise high enough? Would insects damage the grain this year? Such worries moved silently beneath ordinary conversation. Near one canal, 2 brothers repaired a damaged section of irrigation wall using mud and bundled reeds. Water leaked slowly through cracks, darkening the earth beneath them. One brother worked while the other watched the flow carefully. Too much water wasted precious river resources. Too little threatened crops. And every crop eventually became part of the storage system feeding Egypt. The connection between field and granary remained constant. Invisible perhaps to outsiders, but obvious to anyone living beside the Nile. By mid-morning, the villages filled with familiar sounds. Grinding stones turning. Donkeys braying. Children carrying water jars. Wooden carts creaking beneath sacks of grain. At a larger granary near a temple estate, laborers unloaded fresh shipments arriving from nearby farms. The workers climbed ladders carrying baskets balanced against their backs while supervisors monitored the process carefully. Inside the granary chambers, The air felt dry and heavy with dust. Shafts of sunlight cut through high openings near the ceiling, illuminating drifting particles that seemed almost motionless in the still air. The workers sweated heavily despite the early hour. Grain storage demanded exhausting physical labor. Sacks had to be lifted repeatedly. Containers cleaned. Floors swept. Older grain rotated toward areas where it could be distributed first. Nothing could simply be piled carelessly and forgotten. Preservation was active work. Constant work. A scribe seated near the entrance dipped his reed brush into ink while recording measurements onto papyrus scrolls. His handwriting remained neat despite the dust coating his arms. One shipment after another. One number after another. The records themselves became another form of preservation. Protecting order. Protecting trust. Without careful accounting, confusion could spread quickly through large food systems supporting thousands of people. At midday, the heat descended fully upon the valley once again. The sun blazed above pale roads and bright rooftops while workers searched for shade wherever they could find it. Inside homes, meals were prepared slowly using foods drawn carefully from storage supplies. Bread, onions, beans, salted fish, beer. Simple foods that carried enormous importance. A mother sat beside her children beneath a shaded courtyard wall while dividing bread into portions for the afternoon meal. Nearby, jars rested against the cool inner wall of the house. Their presence brought quiet reassurance. Not abundance perhaps, but stability. For now. Outside the village, fishermen worked beneath woven shade coverings while repairing drying racks used for preserving fish. The wood had cracked beneath months of heat and sun exposure. One fisherman replaced broken bindings using strips of reed fiber soaked briefly in water to make them flexible again. Repair mattered everywhere in Egypt. Storage systems depended upon maintenance. Broken baskets. Cracked jars. Damaged roofs. Weak doors. Every weakness threatened food supplies eventually. By late afternoon, shadows lengthened slowly across the land. The harsh brightness softened. Workers returning from the fields moved more slowly now, tired from the heat pressing against their bodies all day. Dust coated their feet and clothing. Some carried small bundles of vegetables harvested from garden plots near irrigation canals. Others led donkeys loaded with empty grain baskets waiting for the next harvest season months away. Even empty baskets held importance. Everything prepared for the future. Inside homes, evening routines began once more. Fires glowed warmly inside ovens while bread baked against hot clay walls. The smell drifted softly through the narrow streets. Children sat beside grandparents listening to quiet stories while waiting for food. Women sorted lentils by lamplight, removing tiny stones or damaged pieces before cooking. A man inspected the household grain jars once more before nightfall. Still enough. Still dry. Still safe. Outside, the Nile reflected the fading orange sky while birds crossed overhead toward marshes and palm groves. Another day had passed. Another day survived through careful preparation and stored food gathered from the fertile land beside the river. And as darkness slowly returned across ancient Egypt once more, the quiet endless rhythm of preservation continued beneath the stars, steady as the Nile itself. The stars above the Nile Valley shimmered softly in the cool darkness before dawn. The river flowed beneath them with slow patient movement, carrying black reflections of palm trees and reed beds along its surface. For a little while longer, Egypt remained quiet. The villages rested beneath the fading night. Mud brick homes held the warmth of yesterday's sun inside their thick walls while rooftop sleepers lay wrapped in thin linen blankets beneath the open sky. A faint breeze moved across the riverbanks. It carried the scent of wet earth and distant smoke. Somewhere far away, a donkey shifted in its sleep. Then, slowly, the first sounds of waking life returned. Inside a small riverside home, an elderly woman opened her eyes before the rest of her family stirred. She sat up carefully on her woven mat, listening to the silence around her. She had awakened early for most of her life. Years of routine had shaped her body into the rhythm of the Nile itself. Without speaking, she rose and moved quietly toward the storage corner near the back wall of the house. The room remained dark except for faint gray light entering through a narrow opening above. Her fingers brushed across the smooth surface of a clay grain jar. Cool. Dry. Familiar. She lifted the lid slightly and leaned closer. The scent rising from inside brought quiet comfort. Good grain. Still safe from dampness. Still enough to carry the household forward. She closed the jar again with careful hands before preparing the morning fire. Outside, the horizon slowly brightened behind the eastern desert. Thin streaks of pale gold spread across the sky while the river reflected the growing light in trembling lines. Soon the village began to move. Grinding stones echoed softly from nearby homes. Bakers reopened ovens still warm from the previous day. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes while carrying small baskets or water jars through dusty streets. The smell of smoke and fresh dough slowly filled the morning air. In ancient Egypt, every day began with food preparation. And every act of preparation began with storage. Inside homes across the Nile Valley, grain was measured carefully each morning. Not too much. Never carelessly. Families balanced daily hunger against future survival with quiet attention shaped by generations of experience. A woman kneading dough knew exactly how quickly the grain supply was falling. A father lifting a beer jar understood how many days remained before brewing would need to begin again. Nothing about food felt separate from time. Storage allowed people to stretch harvests across long months of uncertainty. Near the riverbank, fishermen prepared their boats beneath the soft early light. Nets hung drying beside wooden poles while men checked knots and repaired damaged sections before pushing into deeper water. One young fisherman carried a small bundle of dried fish wrapped in linen cloth. His breakfast. Preserved from a catch several days earlier. The fish smelled strongly of salt and river air. He ate slowly while watching the water move around the reeds near shore. Nearby, older fishermen discussed water levels in low quiet voices. The flood season remained months away, yet already people watched the Nile closely. Every change mattered. Too little flooding could weaken crops. Too much could damage homes and storage buildings near the river. The balance was delicate. Always delicate. As sunlight spread farther across the valley, workers moved steadily toward fields and workshops. Farmers carried hoes across their shoulders while laborers headed toward granaries, bakeries, breweries, and temple storehouses. Egypt survived through organized routine. Not speed. Not noise. Routine. At a large granary near a temple complex, the storage chambers opened once more for the day's work. Workers stepped inside carrying baskets while cool dusty air drifted outward through the doorway. The interior remained dim even after sunrise. Tall walls blocked much of the heat and light, protecting the grain within. Inside, laborers inspected the storage piles carefully. Some grain needed turning to prevent trapped warmth from creating moisture. Other sections required sweeping after insects had appeared near the edges overnight. Nothing was ignored. Preservation depended upon constant small actions. A supervisor walked slowly between the grain chambers while scribes recorded measurements beside him. The scratch of reed brushes against papyrus blended softly with the rustle of grain and distant footsteps. The work felt endless, yet deeply important. Outside the granary walls, Market Street slowly filled with activity. Merchants arranged goods beneath woven shade coverings while donkeys carried baskets through crowded roads. The market smelled alive already. Dry grain, dates, sweat, dust, fresh bread, fish preserved in salt. Clay jars of oil lined some stalls while others displayed onions hanging in braided ropes. Women inspected lentils carefully before purchasing them, checking for insects or damaged pieces. Everyone understood preservation. Everyone understood spoilage. In Egypt's heat, food could turn quickly if neglected. Near the center of the market, a merchant sat beside large woven baskets filled with dried figs pressed tightly into dark sweet cakes. He cut small portions carefully with a bronze knife while flies buzzed lazily through the warm air nearby. The figs had traveled by boat from farther south along the Nile. Preservation made such journeys possible. Fresh fruit would never survive long beneath the sun. But dried fruit could move across the kingdom slowly and safely. Trade itself depended upon storage techniques. By mid-morning, the sunlight became stronger. The roads brightened almost white beneath the heat while workers wiped sweat from their necks and arms. In the fields, irrigation channels shimmered beside rows of grain and vegetables. Farmers moved carefully along narrow ridges of packed earth, guiding water toward crops that thirsted beneath the growing sun. The sound of flowing water mixed with insect hums and distant voices. A farmer paused beside the canal and looked across his field quietly. He was already thinking months ahead. How much grain would these plants produce? Would it fill the jars properly this year? Would there be enough to trade after taxes were collected? The future lived constantly inside Egyptian farming. Every green shoot represented stored food waiting to exist. At midday, heat settled heavily across the valley once more. Villages became quieter while workers rested beneath shade where possible. Inside homes, storage rooms remained among the coolest spaces available. Thick mud brick walls protected grain jars from direct sunlight while woven coverings kept insects away. A young mother entered one such room carrying a small clay bowl. She crouched beside a jar of barley and scooped out enough for the evening meal. Her child followed behind quietly. Watching. Learning. The mother checked the inside edges of the jar before sealing it again. No moisture. No insects. Good. These small inspections happened countless times every day across Egypt. Often without words. Simply part of life. Outside, craftsmen repaired tools connected to food storage and transport. Potters shaped new jars upon spinning wheels while basket weavers worked beneath shade coverings, twisting reeds into strong containers. Everything supporting survival required maintenance. Jars cracked. Baskets weakened. Ropes frayed. Workers spent much of their lives repairing the systems that protected food. Near a workshop close to the river, two men repaired a grain cart damaged during transport. Wooden wheels dried and split easily beneath the heat if neglected too long. The men hammered pegs carefully into place while sweat rolled down their backs. Nearby, a donkey rested in the shade chewing slowly beside empty grain sacks. Even animals became part of Egypt's preservation system. Oxen plowed fields. Donkeys carried harvests. Cats guarded grain stores from rats and mice. Everything worked together. By late afternoon, the light softened at last. Workers began returning home through dusty roads while the breeze from the river cooled the edges of the day. Cooking fires appeared once more throughout the villages. Smoke drifted upward into orange evening light. Inside homes, Grain taken from storage earlier in the day became bread. Dried herbs flavored lentil stews. Fish preserved weeks earlier was softened in water before cooking. Families gathered together beneath flickering lamps. Children leaned sleepily against parents while food was shared carefully across woven mats. Outside, neighbors spoke quietly near doorways while dogs wandered slowly through the fading light. The Nile reflected the deepening colors of sunset. Orange, gold, purple. Then slowly blue darkness again. As night settled across Egypt once more, workers checked storage jars one final time before sleep. Some lifted lids briefly. Others simply rested a hand against cool clay surfaces as reassurance. Still enough. Still safe. Still carrying life forward into tomorrow. And beneath the endless stars above the Nile Valley, the quiet ancient work of storing food continued, patient and steady, just as it had for countless generations before. The night air over the Nile carried a gentle warmth that lingered long after sunset. Along the riverbanks, reeds swayed slowly beside dark water while frogs called softly from hidden marshes. The stars above ancient Egypt seemed endless, scattered across the sky like pale grains of sand. Most of the valley slept peacefully now. The day's labor had settled deeply into tired muscles and heavy eyelids. Farmers rested on rooftops beneath open skies. Bakers slept beside cooling ovens. Fishermen lay wrapped in linen blankets near their boats pulled safely onto shore. But even in sleep, the rhythm of food and storage remained close to every life. Inside one small home near a narrow canal, a mother stirred quietly sometime during the deepest part of night. The room around her was dark except for moonlight slipping through a roof opening above. She listened for a moment. Only breathing. Only distant river sounds. Slowly she rose and crossed the room barefoot, careful not to wake the children sleeping nearby. She paused beside a storage basket hanging from the wall beams and adjusted the woven cover tied across the top. A simple habit. Almost unconscious. But habits like these protected families across Egypt. The basket held dried onions gathered weeks earlier and hung high to keep insects and mice away. Nearby, jars of grain stood against the coolest wall of the house where the night air helped preserve them. Satisfied, the woman returned quietly to her sleeping mat while outside the Nile continued its endless movement through darkness. Farther north, near one of the larger temple estates, a group of laborers worked by torchlight unloading grain from a late-arriving boat. The river journey had taken longer than expected because weak winds forced the crew to row through much of the afternoon heat. Now, under the calmer night sky, the final sacks were carried into storage chambers before dawn. The workers moved slowly with exhaustion. Dust clung to their arms. Sweat darkened their linen clothing even in the cooler night air. Inside the temple granary, torchlight flickered against tall mud brick walls lined with enormous jars and storage bins. The smell inside was thick and dry. Grain dust. Old straw. Clay. Warm air trapped from the day before. A scribe seated near the entrance recorded the delivery carefully while rubbing tired eyes between lines of writing. His reed brush scratched softly across papyrus sheets as the workers continued unloading basket after basket. No one spoke loudly. The night itself seemed to encourage quietness. Outside the temple walls, the nearby village rested beneath moonlight. Dogs wandered narrow streets searching for scraps while cats slipped silently through storage areas hunting mice among the shadows. Cats had become trusted protectors of Egyptian food supplies long before many households considered them companions. A single cat could prevent enormous damage inside granaries and homes alike. People noticed their usefulness carefully. Especially during difficult years when every handful of grain mattered deeply. Toward the final hours before dawn, cooler air settled more heavily across the valley. Workers sleeping on rooftops pulled blankets closer while palm leaves rustled softly overhead. Then the eastern horizon slowly began to pale. Another day approached. In the bakeries, the first fires were lit before sunrise. Young workers carried baskets of grain into grinding rooms while older bakers inspected yesterday's flour supplies. Inside one bakery near the center of a busy town, the ovens still held warmth from the previous evening. The air smelled comforting already. Ash. Dry flour. Warm clay. A baker poured grain into a grinding basin while another mixed dough inside a shallow clay trough. Their movements were quiet and steady after years of repetition. Bread for laborers. Bread for fishermen. Bread for market sellers. Bread for temple workers. The entire valley would wake hungry soon. Outside, fishermen prepared boats beneath the soft gray light before sunrise. Nets were checked carefully for tears while hooks and reed traps were gathered from storage baskets near the shore. One older fisherman paused beside a drying rack filled with preserved fish prepared several days earlier. He pressed one gently between rough fingers. Dry enough. Safe enough. The fish would last much longer now. He nodded quietly to himself before turning back toward the river. Preservation brought comfort to people who lived close to uncertainty. Even a small supply of dried fish hanging beside a doorway could ease worry during lean weeks. As morning spread across Egypt once more, the valley slowly filled with movement and sound. Grinding stones echoed through homes. Donkeys carried water jars along dusty roads. Farmers walked toward fields shimmering softly beneath the growing light. The Nile reflected pale gold beneath the rising sun. Along the irrigation canals, workers inspected water levels carefully. Small barriers of mud and reeds redirected water toward thirsty crops while children chased birds away from planted areas. The work required patience. Always patience. Fields could not be rushed. Harvests could not be hurried. Storage itself demanded waiting. Drying grain properly took time. Drying fish took time. Even bread dough required waiting before baking. Life beside the Nile moved according to rhythms beyond human control. By mid-morning, the heat returned gradually. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads while sweat darkened collars and backs. Inside homes, women measured grain carefully from household jars while planning meals for the day ahead. Some households remained comfortable after strong harvest seasons. Others already watched supplies more cautiously. A widow living alone in a small village home lifted the lid from her main grain jar and stared quietly inside. Not much remained. Enough perhaps for now. But not enough to waste. She scooped grain slowly into a small basket while mentally counting how many loaves could still be baked before market day arrived again. Such calculations shaped ordinary Egyptian life constantly. Not dramatic fears. Quiet, careful awareness. At the larger markets near river ports, preserved foods filled shaded stalls beneath woven coverings. Merchants arranged dried dates, garlic, onions, lentils, and salted fish in neat rows while flies drifted lazily through the warm air. Trade boats arriving from different regions brought slightly different goods depending upon local harvests and river conditions. Some boats carried jars of oil. Others carried beer or wine sealed carefully against spoilage. Everything depended upon storage techniques developed through generations of experience. Near one busy market corner, a merchant sold clay storage jars of many sizes. Some were small enough for herbs or oil. Others large enough to hold months of grain. Customers inspected them carefully before buying. Cracks meant danger. Weak clay meant danger. A good storage jar protected survival itself. The potter who made them understood this well. His hands remained stained with dried clay after long days shaping vessels beneath the heat. He knew which jars cooled well, which lids sealed tightly, which shapes stacked safely inside crowded storage rooms. His work touched lives he would never see. By midday, heat pressed heavily upon the valley once again. The streets grew quieter while workers rested beneath shade wherever possible. Inside large granaries, however, labor continued steadily. Grain still needed inspection. Floors needed sweeping. Deliveries needed recording. A supervisor walked slowly through one storage chamber carrying a small oil lamp despite the daylight outside. The deeper rooms remained dim and cool beneath thick walls. He paused beside one grain pile and crouched carefully. Something smelled slightly different. Not spoiled yet, but warmer than it should be. He called quietly for workers to shift the grain and increase airflow through that section before moisture could spread. Such vigilance prevented disaster. The Egyptians learned through centuries of experience that neglect destroyed food silently. One careless moment during storage could undo months of labor beneath the sun. Outside, the river moved steadily past villages and temple walls while trade boats drifted along the current carrying preserved food toward distant settlements. Children played beside irrigation canals while elders rested beneath palm shade watching the water. The entire civilization breathed through these slow cycles of growth, storage, preservation, and careful distribution. As evening approached again, the harsh brightness softened. Workers returned home with tired steps while cooking fires flickered alive across the valley. The smell of bread drifted once more through narrow streets. Families gathered together beneath warm lamplight. Food taken carefully from storage earlier in the day now rested upon woven mats ready to be shared. Bread, beans, onions, dried fish softened in water. Simple meals. Meals that existed because countless quiet acts of preservation had succeeded once again. Outside, the Nile reflected the first stars returning to the darkening sky. And across ancient Egypt, beneath the warm desert wind and the endless patient stars, the ancient work of storing food continued softly into another peaceful night. The Nile Valley settled into a quiet that felt almost complete, as if even the wind had grown gentler in respect for the sleeping land. The last lamps inside the villages flickered low. Then one by one, they disappeared. Homes that had held movement and sound through the day now rested in stillness again. Mud brick walls cooled slowly after the heat of sunlight, releasing warmth into the night air in soft invisible breaths. Inside those homes, storage jars remained where they always were. Against walls. Under shelves. In corners shaped by years of routine. They did not change. They did not move. They simply waited. Grain, dried fish, onions, lentils, oil, beer, all resting in quiet readiness for another morning, another meal, another day shaped by the river. Out beyond the villages, the Nile continued its slow journey through darkness. It reflected the sky without effort, carrying stars along its surface as if time itself could drift upon water. Reeds along the banks swayed gently. Palm trees stood still against the horizon. Somewhere far away, a lone boat moved faintly with the current, its shape nearly lost in the night. Life along the river had always been this way. Careful. Steady. Dependent on preparation more than certainty. And food storage had been the quiet foundation beneath it all. Not grand. Not loud. Just constant. A rhythm of human hands repeating the same simple acts across generations. Harvesting grain. Drying fish. Sealing jars. Repairing baskets. Measuring flour. Guarding against spoilage. Protecting what the land gave, so it could last beyond the moment it was gathered. Inside sleeping homes, families breathed softly in the dark. No longer working. No longer moving. Only resting beside the quiet assurance that tomorrow's food had already been prepared, already preserved, already waiting. The river breeze passed over rooftops and through palm groves, cooling the valley a little more as the night deepened. Stars brightened above the desert. The land grew still. And in that stillness, ancient Egypt felt not like a distant civilization of monuments and kings, but like something simpler and closer. A people living beside a river. Storing what they could. Trusting the next day would come. And as the final hours of night stretched gently across the Nile, everything remained calm, steady, and quiet, until even the idea of time itself seemed to slow, carried softly forward by the river into silence.